Orléans lives in tension. The days are similar to each other. Hunger, fear, gossip, prayer. Night is worse because then everything seems closer. The sounds of the enemy camp, distant screams, the cracking of wood, sometimes a whistle that you can't see but suddenly ends someone's life. People in Orléans no longer need grand strategies. They need one. To believe that they were not alone. And then she enters the city. Joanna d'Arc. Not in the golden armor from the movie. In the real world things are dirtier, heavier, simpler. But the symbol works even when it doesn't shine. Her entrance is like turning on a light in a room where everyone is sitting in the dark. Not because the light solves the problem, but because suddenly you can see that you can breathe at all. The crowd looks at her like she's something what fell from the sky. Not because she is beautiful or rich. Because it's different. She's sure. It goes straight. Her eyes don't move away. And even if he's scared inside too, then no one sees it. In moments like these, people don't ask, does that make sense? People ask if this gives hope. Joanna came on a mission. But a mission in the real world always comes down to mundane things. About commanders who don't like it when someone interferes with their competencies. About soldiers who have had enough. About people who suspect provocations. Before the first order is given, Joanna enters a maze of glances and whispers. There are people in Orléans who have already given up in their heads. Although the walls are still standing. There are those who hate the English so much that they also hate everything which reminds us of their powerlessness. There are also those who pray for a miracle, but when a miracle enters the gate, they ask in whispers, what if it is false? What if it's a trap? Joanna doesn't answer this like a diplomat. He responds like someone who doesn't even accept that he might lose. He's talking about an attack. It talks about action. He says we have to move forward. And here the first rasp appears, which is important to this story. Because there are commanders in the city who want to play it safe. They know war. They know what it means to storm the fortifications. They know people will die. They know that you can lose everything in one day. Their caution is rational. But caution has a price. Caution in a siege is like waiting until the water in the lungs recedes on its own. He doesn't back down. It only gets worse over time. Joanna therefore comes into conflict with military logic. And he doesn't do it in a soft way. He doesn't come into the room and say, maybe we'll try. She says, let's go. This is the moment when a legend is born in the true sense, not only in the sense of a story. Because a legend begins when a person does something that others do not do. Even though everyone has the same fear. Orléans has resistance points around it, fortifications, enemy position. Each of them is like a tight hand around the city's throat. To destroy one is not to win. But destroying one means that the enemy is no longer immortal. Joanna starts with what is most difficult in such moments. From breaking the stillness. From getting people to move. First he goes to the soldiers. He speaks simply. He speaks like someone who does not negotiate, but only brings a decision. It talks about God, about mission, about victory. In normal times, some of them would have smiled. But there are no normal times in a siege. Something is happening somewhere between her words and people's glances that cannot be measured in numbers. The temperature is changing. The tension in the air changes. It was as if someone had turned a key in the lock and suddenly the door that had been locked for months began to open. And then the first day comes in which Orléans stops just waiting. They leave. They're moving. Joan's banner goes with them. This is not a scene from a hero movie in perfect light. It's chaos, screaming, mud, smoke, fear in your mouth like metal. Steps that don't sound like a march, only like an escape forward. And here you need to understand one thing. What Joanna does doesn't have to be that she's a tactical genius. It is enough that it is a catalyst. That there is a spark that makes someone who would die in hunger anyway, chooses to die in movement. The enemy position they are attacking is not an abstraction. That's specific. Palisades, fortifications, archers, crossbowmen, people who do the same thing, only on the other side. There are tired people there too. There are people there too who are afraid that if they let go today, tomorrow they will be alone in the middle of a besieged city. The first assault is not pretty. The first assault is a test. A test to see if Orléans is still alive. Someone falls, someone screams. Someone is moving back. And then Joanna is where she shouldn't be if she were to care about life. It's close, too close. He sees what commanders usually cannot see from a safe distance. And her presence does something that should be impossible. People who start to retreat, they turn back. Because if she's standing, how can they escape? This is the brutal psychology of war. The one with the better weapon doesn't always win. Sometimes the winner is the one who can get over the moment when you say enough is enough in your head. The storm lasts a long time. Longer than everyone wants. Time no longer matters. Only this section of the wall counts, these few meters, this gate, this embankment. At some point the first rail signal appears. The enemy is retreating. Not because he lost everything, but because he felt that there were no longer any defenders in front of him. They are attackers. Orléans breathes. But war gives nothing for free. For every breath, someone pays with blood. And then comes this moment that sounds like a script but actually happened. Joanna is injured. It's not a gentle scratch that you can be proud of. This is the wound that reminds her that the body is not a legend, that the body has its limits, that pain exists even for those who talk about mission. When this happens, everyone is waiting for one thing, that she will withdraw, that she will disappear, that the legend will break, because a legend is something that does not bleed. But Joanna does something that turns it into a story for the ages. He's coming back. He returns to the rope, returns to the people, returns to the place where the enemy is visible again. And he doesn't come back quietly. He comes back for everyone to see. Because right now the most important thing is not does she have the strength. The most important thing is whether people will believe that the strength came back with her. This is the moment when psychology jumps to another shelf. The soldier who wanted to run away, now he is ashamed to want to run away. The commander who wanted to delay begins to fear that he will be remembered as the one who stopped the miracle. And a miracle, even if it is only a word, has more power in politics than argument. The next days bring more blows. One enemy position is weakened. The second one loses its meaning. The third one is starting to look like something. What can you take? Everyone is aware that this can change at any time. Everyone is aware that in every wait a minute the English can do something which extinguishes everything in one move. But it also starts working the other way at any moment. 'Cause now something's coming to Orléans which wasn't there before. Initiative. Finally, the day of breakthrough comes. Not the kind where everyone suddenly falls to their knees and says, it's over. Rather, one in which the enemies understand that this siege is no longer delivering what it was intended to deliver. That the cost is rising. That the risk is increasing. That this symbol in the city is starting to make them look like losers to the teenager. Orléans is unblocked in 1429. And at this moment something happens that is crucial for Joanna's entire story. The legend is no longer local gossip. The legend becomes a political fact. The news travels faster than the army. People repeat them at wells, in churches, on markets. The story simplifies along the way, it becomes shiny and full of details. Everyone adds something of their own to it. Some say God came back for France. Others say we are a sign that the king has the right to rule. Still others say it's propaganda. It's theatre. But even those who say theatre must admit, theatre just changed the course of the war. And here a question arises that begins to scratch the rulers like a stone in their shoe. If Joanna could do what the commanders couldn't, who is really running this country? This is a question the king does not want to hear. Even if the king doesn't say it out loud, he will hear them in the silence after the audience. In the glances of people outside. In the way Joanna is talked about at the table, and only then about him. And this is where the story takes a step further. Because after Orléans, Joanna is no longer just the city's rescuer. Joanna becomes a signpost. He says, we're going to Reims. To modern ears, Reims sounds like just another name. But then Reims is a key in the ritual of power. This is where the coronation takes place. This is where the discussion about who is the rightful king of France symbolically ends. Joanna understands or feels that victory in the field is one thing, and victory in people's heads is another. You can win the battle and lose the country. You may win the battle and be considered a usurper. Coronation is a seal. And a seal is something that in the Middle Ages could weigh more than a sword. Charles, the Dauphin, now has a chance that he didn't have before. But it's not an easy decision. The road to Reims is not a walk. Reims is in a zone of uncertainty. There are towns along the way that may close. There are troops that can strike. There are political landmines that can explode without warning. And yet after Orléans it is impossible to return to the old mode. You can't tell people thank you for the miracle, now back to the plan. Joanna enters a game where the stakes are higher than victory over the English. The definition of power is at stake. And now the march begins. A march that acts like a wave. One town hears that Joanna is coming. The second city hears that Joanna is close. The third one hears that if he doesn't give up, will be on the wrong side of history. It's not the same everywhere. There are places where you need to negotiate. There are places where you have to show strength. There are places where people open the gates not because they love Carol, but because they do not want to be the ones who closed the gates against Joanna. This is the amazing quality of legend. A legend can make people decide before they can analyze it. They finally reach Reims. And here comes the scene that should end the film. The one with subtitles. Charles is crowned. Joanna stands by, not as a queen, not as one could, but as one that brought about. The one who made the ritual possible. In 1429, the Dauphin becomes Charles VII. And for a moment it seems that the story has ended. The girl had a mission. The mission was accomplished. The king has been anointed. God seemed to speak through events. But it's at moments like these that history likes to do something cruel. Only then does the real conflict begin. Because now, after the coronation, there is tension that didn't exist before. Joanna achieved her goal. And a man who achieves a goal becomes unpredictable to those who want to control it. Conversations begin in hushed tones outside. Conversations about what's next. Talks about how to stabilize the situation now. Talks about it may be time to return to diplomacy. That maybe it's not worth the risk. That it might be better to negotiate than to burn down more cities. That sounds reasonable. And that's why it's dangerous. Because the common sense of the court often means one thing. Protect power, not necessarily win the war. Protect the structure, not necessarily complete the revolution. Joanna doesn't feel like a politician. She feels it like someone who lives in a different order. For her, victory is movement. For the court, victory is control. And now comes the question that will cut this story like a knife. Should Joanna continue to lead people? Should he continue to push the war forward? Should it continue to be a sign? Because if he keeps winning, the legend will grow even more. And as the legend grows, it may begin to shine brighter than the crown. And this is the situation that the authorities hate the most. When the symbol no longer belongs to her. That's when the subtle change begins. There isn't a single scene where anyone talks Joanna, thank you already. There is no brutal order. You're leaving. It's not that simple. The court rarely kills a legend outright. The court prefers to weaken it slowly. Tire. Get lost in the procedures. Stop where it will no longer spark. Joanna begins to encounter resistance that didn't exist before. He begins to encounter procrastination. He begins to encounter decisions postponed until tomorrow. He begins to encounter glances that show more coldness than admiration. And she does not understand that the authorities sometimes prefer to lose a part of the war than to give up the reins of the narrative. Joanna still wants to go. He still wants to attack. He still wants to push. He still wants to take advantage of the momentum. And this is where the story starts to get dangerous. Because when a symbol no longer fits the plan, the symbol is no longer protected. And when a symbol is no longer protected, one mistake is enough. One bad day. One place on the map where there will be no support. One gate that won't open. One moment when someone says we can't do it now. And Joanna, who until now entered the fire and came out as a sign, begins to approach the moment when fire will no longer be a metaphor. He doesn't know about it yet. It's still coming. He still believes that history is a straight line, not a network of interests. Meanwhile, on the other side there are people who they understand something that is the foundation of this era. War is not won by the sword alone. War is not won by assault alone. Wars are not won only in the field. Wars are also won in stories. And if you can't stop Joanna on the battlefield, you can try to stop her somewhere else. On paper. In the process. In questions that are not meant to find the truth, but to find fault. And now imagine that you are in Joanna's place at this moment. You are 19 years old. You have been under siege. You survived the wound. You led the king to his coronation. People talk about you as a sign, as a miracle, as someone who will lead further. And yet you feel that something is changing. You feel that doors that previously opened on their own now open more slowly. You feel the stairs which previously had a sense of wonder, now has a sense of calculation in it. You feel that power begins to weigh you on a scale where there is no room for gratitude. And that's where we'll stop in this section. Because the next moment will begin, where the legend enters an area where courage and faith are not enough. Where a banner is not enough. Where it's not enough that people love you. In the next part you will see how history can trap a person and then pretend it was justice. Because if Orléans was the moment of the birth of a legend, then what is coming will be the beginning of its destruction. Joanna doesn't wake up one day thinking, now they will betray me. It doesn't work that way. Betrayal rarely comes in one sharp cut. More often it resembles slowly turning on the air in the room. You seem to be breathing, but it's getting harder every day. After the coronation in Reims, everything looks like a victory. In people's minds it is no longer just a war. This is a story that has begun to come to an end. There are those who believe they have just seen the finger of God. There are those who say that Joan has become a weapon that France has not had for a long time. There are also those who look at all this as a growing problem. Because the thing about legend is that at some point it stops being a tool. It's starting to become a force. And a force you don't control becomes a threat, even if it works in your interest. In Reims, Joanna sees Charles wearing a crown. She sees the moment she has been talking about from the beginning. You see it in her attitude. This is not the triumph of someone who has gained power. This is the relief of someone who has completed a mission, as if she could put aside a burden for a moment that no one else even noticed. It's just that the war doesn't give you time for relief. War is like fire. If you stop adding, it doesn't expire immediately. It starts to smolder in a way you can't control. Joanna wants to move on. For her, momentum is sacred. If your opponent retreats, you don't give him time. If people believe that you are a sign, you take advantage of it before faith turns into routine. She feels this is the moment where you can finish the work. The court feels something different. The court feels that now the mode needs to be changed. From war to politics, from risk to control, from chaos to arrangement. And that's when the friction begins. Not in the form of an argument in front of everyone. Not in the form of an order. In the form of minor delays. Consultation. Meetings that last too long. In the form of decisions that are not made. In the form of people who start talking to Joanna differently than before. This is one of the strangest things ever. Sometimes, after the greatest victory, you start to lose. Because winning changes what people want from you. Before Reims, Joanna was needed as a spark. After Reims, Joanna is a problem. Because a spark can also ignite those who hold her. And now there comes a moment that acts as a warning in the story. Joanna wants to hit. He wants to act. And the court begins to play the delaying game. As if he hoped that the legend would calm down on its own over time. As if he hoped that people would stop looking at the banner and start looking at the crown again. Joanna doesn't understand this. Or he understands and ignores it because he can't do otherwise. The symbol doesn't work when it starts to translate. And that's why in the following weeks Joanna does what she does best. It moves forward, even if underfoot, there is no longer the same support as before. This is important because this is where the mechanism begins, which will later lead her to ruin. The authorities don't have to betray you outright. All it takes is for it to stop protecting you. And then one day is enough, one place, one gate, and suddenly it turns out that the sign is only a human. Joanna takes part in further activities. Trials, clashes, pressure. It is still energy. It is still a point around which people gather. But the air is different now. There is less enthusiasm outside, more calculations, less blind faith, more questions. What if it all gets out of control? At some point she realizes that not everyone wants to go as far as she does. That some people would rather stop now, when they have a crown on their head and can talk about legitimacy. Because the crown gives certainty that battle cannot. Joanna doesn't buy it. For her, war is simple. The enemy is there. You have to go there. Her world does not consist of penumbra. And that's why history begins to break her down. Because history loves penumbra. Over time, activities become more risky. At some points, Joanna receives less support than she should. It's not always visible at first glance. But in war, the lack of support can be like a missing nail in a wheel. You're driving until suddenly the wheel falls off. Joanna is still on the front line. Still where the legend should be, if the legend is to work. The problem is that the legend works best when someone in the background makes sure the legend doesn't hit a dead end. And this is where it starts to turn into a dead end. Spring of 1430. Bathing. A city that doesn't sound like a turning point in world history. And yet this is where the end of Joanna as a free person begins. Not immediately as a symbol. A symbol can live longer than a human. But that's the end of Joanna, who can still decide about her own move. Siege, raids, confusion. This isn't a scene where the camera shows a big battle in the setting sun. This is the type of war that kills most often. Chaotic, dirty, full of accidents. One unit moves, the other is late. One gate closes, the other does not. One commander understands the situation, the other one doesn't. Joanna takes part in the trip. He wants to hit. He wants to do what he always does, break through the moment of fear. Only this time the moment of fear is not on the defender's side. This time it is she who enters a space where everything can and does turn around. Joanna is cut off. Suddenly it turns out that there is no way back. The gate is closing. At this point the story does a thing that the viewer hates but is real. The hero does not die in battle. The hero is captured. Joanna is captured by the Burgundians. And here I have to say something that sounds cold, but that was life. In that era, a man in captivity is a value. He is a card. It is a coin. It is a tool. Burgundians don't have to love her to know how much it's worth. They don't have to understand it to know that her name has power. And that's why Joanna is not treated like an ordinary captive. Because Joanna is not just a girl. Joanna is a problem. The English understand this best. For the English, Joanna is dangerous, even if he's in a cell. Because as long as he lives, faith can live, that he will come back. As long as he lives, so long can the story live, that God is still on France's side. And wars are not won only by the sword. Wars are also won by what people believe in, so the English want Joanna. Not to just kill her. You can kill quickly and take risks, that she would become a martyr. The English want to do something smarter, in their understanding. They want to destroy it so that its legend will burst, and for this they need a tool that looks like justice. Joanna is handed over to the trial. You could say she was brutally sold. It doesn't have to be a scene with a bag of gold, but the logic is similar. Handing over a valuable captive into the hands of those who have an interest in exploiting it. And at this point the question arises, which hurts the most? Where is the king? Where is Charles VII, whose crown Joanna led to Reims? Why is there no major rescue operation? Why is there no prisoner exchange? Why isn't there everything that is done for the heroine in legends? The answer: no one likes sound politics. Because to save Joanna is to admit that it's worth the risk. And the risk means the legend will continue to grow. And the legend continues to grow and may be a bigger problem for the king than her death. You don't have to believe it as a conspiracy. You just need to understand the mechanism. Power loves those who are useful, but he is afraid of those who are independent. Joanna goes to Rouen, in the sphere of English influence. To the place where history changes tools. It's not about the sword anymore. It's about the language, the paragraph, about the question. If it can be proven that Joan was a heretic, that her voices were devilish, that her actions were a curse, and not a sign, then the victory at Orléans ceases to look like evidence of God's support. It's starting to look like a scam. And Charles' coronation, done under her influence, begins to look tainted. This is a game with the highest stakes. Legitimacy is at stake. And then a man comes on stage, who will become the face of the trial. Bishop Pierre Coquin. In history, a name sometimes sounds like a sound. Coquin sounds like a mechanism. He's a man who has an interest for the process to go in a specific direction. A man who understands that if the trial looks ecclesiastical, legal, legitimate, the effect will be stronger than any execution without a verdict. Joanna is young, she is tired, is in isolation. There are no people who have an interest to really protect her. He only has himself. And now the most terrible part of this story begins, because this is not a drama about does she have the courage to fight. This is a drama about whether you can break a person with questions. The process is not one meeting. It's a series of interrogations. It's a series of pressures. It's a maze from which there is no exit. Every question is like a wire. If you pull in the wrong direction, tightens. Joanna stands in front of people who have education, language, and procedures. She has her words, her faith, your intuition. It's an unequal fight, like a knife fight with a book. It's just that the book has power. They ask her about the votes. They ask her about the saints. They ask her if she believes in the church. They ask her about obedience. They ask her so that the answer is always wrong. If he says the voices come from God, they may say prove it. If he says he doesn't know, they may say you're lying. If she says she's sure, they might call it hubris. If she says she's not sure, they can say so it's the devil. This is trap logic. And here comes what is most podcast-like in this story. Joanna often responds cleverly. Sometimes the answer is that the people on the other side don't get what they want. And that's what makes the process more brutal. Because when you can't destroy someone with arguments, you start destroying them with conditions. Isolation, pressure, fear, fatigue, and at some point they come to the point which may sound strange to moderns. But back then it was a powerful tool. Outfit. Joanna wore men's clothes. Armor, pants, items that were practical for her. In war and travel. But in the process, practicality does not matter. What matters in the process is the symbol. If it can be represented as this, who breaks the order, who breaks the role, who insists on what is forbidden, it is easier to build an image of someone who is disobedient to the church. And disobedience to the church is a word that can kill in this world. Joanna explains that it was necessary, that it was for safety, that it was part of her mission. But any translation can be restated. Security? So you admit you didn't trust people? Mission? So you put your mission above the rules? Need? So you think you can choose which rules apply to you? Questions are not asked in order to understand. They are asked to catch. At some point, the worst question that could be asked to someone like Joanna is asked. Will you submit to the authority of the church? It sounds simple. But this is a question of control. If she says yes without conditions, she must renounce what she said about the voices. If she says no, she may be considered a heretic. If he says yes, but yes, if, you can consider it a smart avoidance and press again. Joanna enters this maze and tries not to die. This is the moment when this story stops being a story about war and becomes a story about language as a weapon. Because in the Middle Ages, language had physical consequences. A bad word could be a sentence. The process continues. The days blend together. Joanna loses track of time. She loses the feeling that anything depends on her. And then the most terrible thing in this story happens. The moment of breaking. It doesn't have to sound like a scream. Sometimes a fracture looks like a silent one, good, like a signature on a piece of paper whose content you don't fully understand, or one you understand too well and you sign because you want it to end. Joanna has to sign something that is a renunciation. She has to admit that she was wrong. He has to promise that he won't go back to what she was doing. He has to give up control of his story. And on the other side is a promise. If you sign, you won't burn. This is trade that a man in a cell does not consider like a strategist. He considers like someone who wants to live. And here is the moment when the listener has the right to stop and feel the cold. Even if Joanna signs, it doesn't mean she won. This may mean that the trial has just found a way to finish her off, because if the legend signs that she was wrong, the legend breaks. And if the legend breaks, even her life may no longer matter. Joanna signs. Or at least agrees to the formula, which looks like a signature. And for a moment it seems like it's over. That she was saved. Except the trial has a second act. Soon the topic of clothing comes up again. The pressure is on again. The trap appears again. Joanna returns to men's clothing. Why? There are different versions. Some say because she was afraid in the cell. Because men's clothing protected her from violence. Others say because someone left it for her on purpose to provoke her. Still others say because she could no longer pretend to be someone she wasn't. Whatever the reason for the process, this is a gift. Because now, you could say, she broke her promise. She returned to what was forbidden. She is a recidivist in heresy. And then the punishment is the worst. And here we end this part. Because in the next, last part you will see the finale. How the process closes like a loop. How the fire returns to Rouen and how, after Joan's death, history does something that always hurts the most. Suddenly he starts saying that it was a mistake. And then the question remains, was it a mistake? Was it a plan from the beginning? Rouen. The same city you remember from the first scenes of this story, but now it is different. Because now Rouen is no longer just a place where a prisoner is held. Rouen is a machine. And the machine, once it starts, doesn't ask did anyone deserve it. The machine only asks whether the procedure can be completed. Joanna is standing inside this machine. On the one hand, he has faith and his own version of truth. On the other hand, there are people who are not looking for the truth, but for a construction that will look like the truth. And this is the difference that the listener should remember. In the Middle Ages, a heretic did not have to be a heretic. It was enough that it could be described that way. After the break, there is silence, which is worse than screaming. Silence after signing. Silence after the promise that if he complies, he will avoid the fire. The silence in which one tries to believe that he still has an influence on fate. And then comes the moment that in this story is like a door slamming from the inside. Joanna returns to men's clothing. We don't know what exactly happened in the cell during those days. We can only put the version together like pieces of a broken mirror. The first version says that she was bullied and tried to protect herself with something that gave her at least a shadow of security. The second version says that someone left her this outfit on purpose because they knew it would be the perfect excuse. Yet another says that Joanna could no longer play the role of repentance, because repentance would kill her in a different way, take away her meaning. No matter what was outside it acted as a signal, like a red light for those who were waiting. In the process, a word appears that is like a lockpick, recidivism. Back to heresy. Breaking a promise. This word opens the shortest path to judgment, because you no longer have to pretend that it is about repairing the soul. Now you can say, we tried, it wasn't possible. Now punishment is necessary. And at this moment you can see the full intelligence of this machine. If Joan had been burned immediately, the world might have seen it as revenge. If she had been burned without a chance, it would have been easier to build the myth of the martyr. But the trial gave them something else. It seems that Joanna chose her own path. It seemed that she was given the opportunity to save herself, and yet she returned to her mistake. Pretend that fire is not politics, only morality. This is one of the most important lessons of this story. When the authorities want to destroy someone without the risk of immortalizing him, they do not always shoot in the body. Sometimes he shoots at credibility. The day of the execution is coming. Not as a sudden shock, only as a point on the axis of events towards which everyone was heading. Rouen is starting to fill up. The crowd is like a living river that flows where the spectacle is promised. Someone wants to see the witch. Someone wants to see a saint. Someone just wants to see the end of the story that is already being talked about everywhere. Joanna goes to the place you know from the beginning. Wooden structure, a stack, a space where people take a step forward because they want to be closer. And now something paradoxical happens. The more the machine was built to kill a legend, the more this moment strengthens the legend. Because at the moment of death a person stops defending himself with arguments. Only the image remains. And the image is the strongest currency in history. Joanna asks for a cross. It sounds simple, but in that world it's a statement. This is the last scene that says I am not who they described me as. I'm not a devil's trick. I am a man who wants to die on my side. Some people hear her words. Others only see fire. Someone cries, someone laughs, someone looks away. And somewhere in all this there's a thing happening, which cannot be undone. Even if the trial wanted to close the story, the mob opens it. Because people don't go home with a paragraph. People go home with a story. The fire is growing. Smoke obscures the face. And then, in this moment, in which erasure was to take place, something more permanent than the body is born. Memory is born. Memory that isn't always precise, but she is always strong. A memory that can last hundreds of years because it hangs in one picture. A girl alone on fire against the system. And now it seems that the story ends. But this is an illusion. Because the best stories don't end there where the hero's life ends. The best stories end where you start to understand what it was all for. After Joanna's death, the war continues. The world doesn't stop because one person disappeared. Except that her death leaves behind something of a crack. As if someone had hit the glass, which is still holding, but the scratch is already running through the entire surface. And here comes the mystery that always electrifies listeners. If Joan was false, if she was diabolical, if she was heresy, why has her story not disappeared? Why has it not been forgotten like hundreds of other processes that no one remembers? You can answer simply because it was effective. And effectiveness is troublesome for the fraud narrative. The success at Orléans and the road to Reims do not disappear just because someone declares them heretical. People saw what happened. People remembered. People had their own experience. So the system did what the system does. He tried to move the frame. To tell you the truth, it wasn't a miracle. It was manipulation. It wasn't a sign. It was a disease. It wasn't a mission. It was the devil. And for a while it worked. The government has a powerful megaphone. But the government also has a problem. The megaphone doesn't control the whispers. Years pass. The balance of power is changing. The English are not so sure. France is starting to regain ground. And then, when history takes another turn, something happens that sounds like irony but is pure politics. In 1456, 25 years after Joan's death, the process is reviewed. Official. Serious. Made by the church. And this process, which was supposed to be legitimate, is annulled. This is the moment where the listener should stop. Because this question is no longer about Joanna. This question is about mechanism. How is it possible that before the truth was this way, and then suddenly the truth becomes the opposite? How is it possible that what was supposed to be justice becomes error? And here's the answer that no one likes but who teaches. Law can be an instrument. Procedure is a tool. And morality can be decoration. The review says in practice, the process was flawed, there was pressure, there was manipulation. There were many things that we would call abuse today. But this revision is not happening in a vacuum. It happens when France finds it profitable to have Joanna on its side. When her story can be empowering, not a threat. And here we come to the most bitter truth of this story. Joanna was both human and pawn. Her faith may have been true. Her courage may have been real. Her mission could have been her mission. But at the same time it was also an element of the game, in which others moved the pieces. Then the second mystery appears. Quieter, but even more disturbing. Was Joanna abandoned? We don't have one document that says the king decided to consecrate it. History rarely provides such pure evidence. But we have something else. Lack. No grand rescue attempt. No desperation to match gratitude. No fire on the part of those to whom she gave the crown. This lack is like a shadow on the wall. You don't have to say conspiracy to see it. Suffice it to say, power often prefers long-term control to short-term heroism. And now that you've got all the way Joanna, you can look at this story as three layers that build on each other. The first layer is the human layer. A girl from Domremy who goes against the grain because she believes she has to. This is the layer where you hear the heart. Visible in Orléans, visible in Reims, visible in the cell, visible on the pile. The second layer is the symbol layer. Joanna as a sign that can change morale. In this layer you don't have to decide, were the voices divine? You just need to understand that people believed it. And collective faith can move history like a lever. The third layer is the political layer. Joanna as a problem that needs to be solved. When a sign is needed, it is taken out. When a character no longer fits, it is weakened. When a sign is dangerous, it is destroyed in a way that is made to look like morality. And now we come to conclusions. Not in the form of a lecture, only in the form of lessons that you take away from the story like hidden blades. First conclusion. The greatest things in history often start with something that sounds incredible. This is why the government is obsessed with controlling the narrative. Because if people believe in the impossible, they may start to act differently. And then they stop being predictable. Second conclusion. What the system is afraid of is not that someone is strong, but that someone is uncontrolled. Joan was not a problem when she led to the coronation. Joanna became a problem when she was able to start driving further. Third conclusion. There are two ways to kill a man in history. The first is to kill the body. The second is to kill credibility. Joanna's trial was an attempt at the second method. The fire was only supposed to be the final signature. Fourth conclusion. Justice without independence is theatre. The more the process looks elegant, the easier it is to manipulate him. This is terrifyingly current because the mechanism is beyond epochs. People trust the form because the form gives a sense of security. Fifth conclusion. Legend is dangerous for those who rule, but it is also the only weapon of those who have nothing. Joanna was a living legend. After her death, the legend became even more useful, only for others. And here comes the moral, which is like a silent voice beneath the whole story. If you want to understand the Middle Ages, don't just look at the swords. Look at the stories. Look at who says them, who finances them, who repeats them and who cuts them. Because the sword wins the battle, but the story wins the memory. And now the darkest part of this story, the one that stays in your mind the longest. Did Joanna really lose? If you look at her life, the answer is brutal. She was captured, humiliated, sentenced, burned. She died young. If that's the definition of losing, then yes, she lost. But if you look at history, for what remains of a human being, something strange is happening. The trial was meant to destroy it, but ultimately it perpetuated it. The fire was supposed to close the topic, but it opened it forever. The process review was intended to correct the error, but at the same time it confirmed that the mistake was a tool. And as a result, Joanna became something what can no longer be withdrawn. A symbol that passes from era to era. And that's why this story still works. Because at all times people recognize the same pattern. Someone comes along with an idea that gives hope. The system uses it. Then the system gets scared. Then the system tries to silence him in a way that who looks moral. It's not just the Middle Ages. This is the mechanism. Now I will leave you with 3 interpretations. Not for you to choose the truth, but for so you can see how different mirrors can be. The first interpretation is spiritual. Joanna was genuinely convinced that it is being conducted. Her faith was so strong that it became a military force. And perhaps in a world where everything was broken, this belief was the only thing that could glue people together as one movement. The second interpretation is psychological. Joanna was an extraordinary person who understood how fear works and was able to overcome it. In this version, votes do not have to be resolved. It is enough that they were the language of the era and she was able to turn this language into motivation. The third interpretation is political. Joanna was a story that turned out to be too powerful. The story that was needed until it led to the coronation, but she became a threat when she could continue driving. In this version, the trial was not a mistake. The trial was the closing of control. And now we return to Rouen, to the first painting. 19 years old. Fire. Crowd. A machine that was supposed to kill a legend. Only the legend doesn't die like that how the body dies. The legend changes hands. And perhaps therein lies the darkest moral of this story. Sometimes a person pays with his whole life so that others can use his name later. Sometimes holiness and propaganda wear the same clothes. Sometimes memory is a reward, but also a theft. And if you want to get something practical out of this story, something that stays in your mind like a tool, not as a decoration, then remember one question. The question that always arises when you see the process, the trial, the scandal, the morality, the cleansing, the truth. Who benefits from this? Because in Joanna's story, the answer is not convenient. Those who needed the sign gained first. Then those who needed it gained, for the sign to disappear. And in the end, those who gained who could say it was a mistake when that mistake stopped hurting them. Joanna didn't have this game in her hands. She only had faith, courage and movement forward. And that's why we keep talking about it. Not because everything in this story is clear. Just because there's something in this story which gives no peace. Awareness that the line between justice and politics is as thin as the paper someone signs. And now, as this story comes to a close, there is one last question that is both the ending and the hook. If Joanna had survived, would she have been allowed to live as Joanna? Would she have to be silenced otherwise? Would the authorities find another trial, another excuse, another form of fire? And maybe that's why this story ends the way it does. Because this is not just a story about a girl from the Middle Ages. This is a story about how the world treats people who become a bigger story than those who rule.